Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Chapter 11 of his book, Philosophy as a Way of Life, Pierre Hadot is going to give us a very useful and fairly succinct history of the development and the divergences from philosophy understood and practiced as a way of life in ancient, medieval, and modern times up to his present in effect in the 20th century. And he's going to be avoiding and calling into question some overly general, not actually based in the text's sweeping oversimplifications of ancient and medieval, and also modern philosophy. And I think that's one of the great benefits of taking the approach that he does. And I want to begin with two contrasts that he's going to make between ancient and modern philosophy that don't hold completely for every single modern philosopher, as we'll see, but which are, I would say, pretty on point. So the first has to do with a question that comes up all the time, particularly in the present, in social media. Who gets to call themselves a philosopher? Who's authorized, who's entitled to view themselves or to view others as philosophers? And he says that one could say that what differentiates ancient from modern philosophy is the fact that in ancient philosophy it was not only important people like Chrysippus or Epicurus who, just because they developed a philosophical discourse, were considered philosophers. Rather, every person who lived according to the precepts of Chrysippus or Epicurus was every bit as much a philosopher as they. And, what is the implication here? That philosophy is kind of a privileged elite caste, as he's going to call it, technicians or experts who work largely within universities in the modern period. And I think that is pretty on point. Although there's probably more room today than at the time that he was writing for people who are trying to practice a philosophical way of life that is indebted to some, classical school to call themselves philosophers. The other thing that he brings up right after that is saying ancient philosophy proposed to mankind an art of living. That was what it was really about. By contrast, modern philosophy appears above all as the construction of a technical jargon that is reserved for specialists. Maybe it trickles down to the ordinary working type people, but for the most part, it's those who are lucky enough to be in tenured posts in universities, right? So these are very big generalizations. Obviously, there are some exceptions, but I think that they do hold for the most part. Now, let's look at the actual history that he's providing us with here. So he is going to talk about ancient philosophy, and he's going to try to dispel some illusions about that. So he says, as we've seen, philosophy in the Hellenistic and Greek period took on the form of, and he's got three things here, a way of life, an art of living, and a way of being. Now, I think that that's something that we actually want to pause on and think about the interconnections between these. So philosophy being proposed as a way of life, a distinctive mode of approaching life, its problems, one's relationships, one's place in society, all of that understood as being informed by philosophical thinking. Art of living, right? This is a common term that comes up, particularly in Stoic philosophy, but in others as well. A techne, a way, an art of thinking things through, of living in a rational manner that realizes and develops your humanity. And then finally, a way of being. So not just a way of living, a way of being as a human being. And all three of these are connected together. So he says, this was nothing new. Ancient philosophy had this character at least as far back as Socrates, maybe further, right? We could think of the legendary seven sages, the listing of which sometimes changes from author to author, but includes people like Solon. You know, if you ever read Solon's poetry, it's full of ideas about life. We could think about the Delphic maxims. We could think of some of the pre-Socratic philosophers. We could even say some of the sophists were about this as well. So, you know, there was a Socratic style of life, he says, and the Socratic dialogue was an exercise which brought Socrates' interlocutor to put himself into question, to take care of himself, and make his soul as beautiful and wise as possible. All of those are part of this, right? The way of life, art of living, and way of being. What about Plato? He says, similarly, Plato defined philosophy as a training for death. He's thinking about the Phaedo there, which arguably is more Platonic than Socratic, and the philosopher as the person who does not fear death because he contemplates the totality of time and being. So what he's saying here is that Platonic philosophy is also philosophy as a way of life. What about Aristotelian philosophy? Isn't Aristotle the great theorist? He says it's sometimes claimed that Aristotle was a pure theoretician, but for him too, philosophy was incapable of being reduced to philosophical discourse or to a body of knowledge. Rather, philosophy for Aristotle was a quality of the mind, the result of an inner transformation. The form of life preached by Aristotle was the life according to the mind. And you might think about, Nick McCann Ethics, Book 10, where the contemplative or theoretical life is prioritized above all others. It is a way of life. It is a bios, right? So ancient philosophy is not just about a way of life in the Hellenistic, post-Aristotelian period. It's there in, from Socrates to Aristotle, and we could think about others as well, Aristippus, the Cyrenaic school, Antisthenes, Diogenes, the Cynic school. We could go on after that. So he's also going to say, there's a widely held cliche or cliches that contaminate the history of philosophy. And this is quite true. You don't actually need to read Hadot to observe this. Look at, authors like Hegel and their take on Hellenistic philosophy, or later on, Heidegger, right? The real action is happening with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. After that, everything is kind of going downhill, just into ethics and living a certain way of life. And Hadot is saying, well, no. If you actually pay attention to the texts, that is not supported. So he's going to say something really quite important here. He says we must not imagine that philosophy was completely transformed during the Hellenistic period, whether after the Macedonian domination over the Greek cities or during the imperial period. Why? On the one hand, it is not the case that the Greek city-state died after 330 BC and political life along with it. I mean, all you have to do is actually read somebody like Epictetus, who is talking with people who are in charge or are playing an important role within Greek city-states long after, into the Christian era, long in the Roman Empire, to realize that really is a false narrative that gets put out there. And he says, above all, the conception of philosophy as an art and form of living It's not linked to political circumstances or to a need to escape mechanisms and inner liberty to compensate for lost political freedom. Already for Socrates and his disciples, philosophy was a mode of life and a technique of inner living. Philosophy did not change its essence throughout the entire course of its history in antiquity. So this is quite important. It shows a continuity that a lot of people from the 19th century on have essentially denied and ignored and bought into a false narrative about. What about the Middle Ages, the medieval period? Well, so if we begin in antiquity with Christianity coming into contact with other modes of thought, particularly pagan Greek philosophy, and Roman philosophy as well, we find out that early Christians who want to present their point of view as a philosophy, really as a choice, a hairesis, similar to that of philosophical sects. He says, in order to present itself as a philosophy, Christianity was obliged to integrate elements borrowed from ancient philosophy. And as a matter of fact, they have good reasons for doing this. He brings up Clement of Alexandria. Hadot doesn't mention here, but Clement is very clear that he thinks that ancient Greek philosophy is a preparation for the gospel in the same way that the law was for the Jewish people, right? So ancient Greek philosophy needs to be incorporated. And we see that the early Christian philosophers, Clement, Lactantius, Justin Martyr, we could name a bunch of others, will say, okay, well, you like these parts of ancient Greek philosophy. We don't like these parts over here. We think they're wrong about this. So we find out that they integrate philosophical spiritual exercises into Christian life. And we, encounter a number of other similar elements. And this runs through early Christian philosophy. We see this in Augustine. We see this in Boethius. But we see it particularly in monasticism. He says the Middle Ages was to inherit the conception of monastic life as Christian philosophy. Now, what does that actually mean as a Christian way of life? He quotes the great scholar Dom Jean Leclerc, as much as in antiquity, philosophia in the monastic Middle Ages designates not a theory or a way of knowing, but a lived wisdom, a way of living according to reason. And what is going to bring this down? Well, it's the rise of the universities. Why? He's going to say the medieval universities witnessed the elimination of the confusion which existed in primitive Christianity between theology and traditional philosophy, one founded on the rule of faith, one founded on reason, and a subordination of philosophy to theology. Philosophy is now no longer the supreme science, but the servant of theology. It supplies the latter with conceptual, logical, physical, metaphysical materials it needs. And he says that if we disregard the monastic use, which continued on, by the way, of the word philosophia, we can say that philosophy in the Middle Ages had become a purely theoretical and abstract activity. It was no longer a way of life. Now, that doesn't mean that they weren't practicing a way of life, but philosophy is now like a tool rather than the ultimate structure of that way of life. He says ancient spiritual exercises were no longer part of philosophy, but found themselves in another place, integrated into Christian spirituality. Neoplatonic mysticism gets prolonged into Christian mysticism. So he says we saw a radical change in the content of philosophy as compared to antiquity. Now, what is so important about the university? He says that one of the characteristics of the university is it's made up of professors who are doing what? Are they engaging in a philosophical life for its own sake? No. They're engaging in a self-reproducing activity. They are training other professors or professionals training professionals. Education was thus no longer directed towards people who were to be educated with a view to becoming fully developed human beings, but to specialists in order that they might learn how to train other specialists. And he says that's the danger of scholasticism, this philosophical tendency which began to be sketched at the end of antiquity and whose presence is still recognizable in philosophy today. And here let's take a little pause. The term scholasticism, in a very strict sense, applies to medieval philosophy and then its continuances in that same tradition later on into the early modern period. However, we can talk about many other movements in philosophy being scholastic in a much broader sense. A lot of contemporary, actually a lot of 20th century analytic philosophy is incredibly scholastic in that sense, doing what Hobbes would criticize the scholastics of his own times with being concerned with jangling words rather than attending to things themselves. The things could be a way of life. And so what we get is scholasticism. And then modern philosophy, in some respects, continues this, but also reacts against it, but does so in a way that incorporates that. So Hadot is going to bring up what we nowadays call the continental rationalists. He says from the 16th to the 18th centuries, genuinely creative philosophical activity would develop outside the university. And who does he bring up? Well, typical French approach, in the persons of Descartes, Spinoza, Malebranche, and Leibniz. And we could also ask, well, what about the British empiricists? Would Locke, Berkeley, Hume, the common sense philosophers like Reid also be included in this? And I think the answer is yes. Hume, definitely outside of the academy, right? He couldn't get a university job because he was thought to be an atheist, perhaps, right? And we could talk about others as well who are on the fringes, Voltaire, the encyclopedists, Rousseau, and we could go on and on and on with this. But he says that philosophy recovered its autonomy vis-a-vis theology, but this movement, born as a reaction against medieval scholasticism, was situated on the same terrain as the latter. In opposition to one kind of theoretical philosophical discourse, there arose yet another theoretical discourse. Now, I'm not entirely sold about that, and even Hadot isn't, because a little bit later he will say, it's no accident Descartes entitled one of his works Meditations. They are indeed meditations, meditatio in the sense of exercise, and Descartes recommends they be practiced over a certain period of time. He talks about Spinoza and similarities to the Stoics in this respect. So, it's kind of a nuanced view. And then we see philosophy rising to prominence within the universities. So he tells us from the end of the 18th century onward, a new philosophy made its appearance within the university, we're talking about German idealism, in the persons of Wolff, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel. From now on, philosophy would be indissolubly linked to the university, with a few exceptions. And he says, we see this in the case of Bergson, Husserl, and Heidegger, who he's going to talk about later. They're all university professors, right? So they're going to be formed and shaped by those concerns. He says philosophy winds up often being reduced to philosophical discourse, and it develops in a different atmosphere and environment from that of ancient philosophy. In modern universities, now I love this diagnosis, philosophy is obviously no longer a way of life or a form of life, with one exception, unless it be the form of the life of a professor of philosophy, right? And you can say, well, how detached is that from the life that other people are living? So, German idealism is doing that. Now, then he's going to bring up a couple important counterexamples, including some people who, in fact, were in universities. So, he talks about Hegel. He says, according to the Hegelian model, human consciousness as a purely historical character. The only lasting thing is the action of the spirit itself. And under the influence of Hegel's method, the idea arose among Marx and the young Hegelians: theory cannot be detached from practice. It is man's action on the world which gives rise to his representations. So that's one way of coming back to philosophy, understood as a living way of being, a way of life, right? He also talks about Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. He actually has a quote from Schopenhauer about how bad university philosophy is. And, Hadot really does see Schopenhauer and Nietzsche as people who worked. Now, Schopenhauer was with the university for a while and then leaves. Actually Nietzsche was too, right? He was a professor of philology and then goes on leave. But they have their greatest effect outside of the university. And he also says both of these men were thinkers steeped in the tradition of ancient philosophy. So no wonder that they invite us to radically transform our way of life. And then he talks about three people who remained university professors, basically as long as they could: Henri Bergson, Edmund Husserl, and Martin Heidegger. And he's going to say that, we see in Bergson and the phenomenology of Husserl that these are less systems than methods for transforming our perception of the world. So not quite philosophies as ways of life, but certainly about transforming the ways in which we see and understand things. And then he says the movement of thought inaugurated by Heidegger and carried on by existentialism seeks, in theory and in principle, to engage man's freedom and action within the philosophical process. But in the last analysis, it too is primarily a philosophical discourse rather than philosophy as a way of life. So what we see in the modern period, according to Hadot, are things that have a lot of potential to be philosophies as ways of life, but they're not quite there. And it's partly because of the holdover from the medieval university and the transformations that take place there. So what is Hadot putting forth for us? I mean, he wants a robust philosophy as a way of life that is probably going to draw heavily on ancient philosophy, as his works in fact do. And that's what we see happening in our own time with, the revival of interest in Stoicism, and to a lesser extent Epicureanism, skepticism, and perhaps also transformations of the way in which Aristotelianism and Platonism are being understood and lived out in the present as well. So, very important little history that I think is quite helpful for those who, don't already know it and may be laboring under some of the prejudices and cliches that have been spread for a couple centuries about the way philosophy has developed and the values involved in that development.